to ask the Scottish Government whether it has any data showing the number of children or parents who were aware that results from the Health and Wellbeing Census could be accessed by third-party researchers.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government is not collecting health and wellbeing census data from local authorities. This data was gathered once between October 2021 and June 2022. Any survey or questionnaire collecting personal data must comply with the key principles set out in data protection legislation. That includes the principle of fairness, lawfulness and transparency. Local authorities were provided with guidance and materials to produce privacy notices to fully explain the purpose of the survey and how the data would be used. Local authorities were responsible for the distribution of the privacy notices to parents and carers in advance of the survey. The Scottish Government therefore does not hold this data.
Megan Gallagher.
3 years ago, the SNP were embroiled in scandal over the shameful school sex survey. The questionnaire was sent to 130,000 children, some as young as 14 years old, and they were asked highly intrusive and inappropriate questions, including asking pupils to detail their sexual experiences. Most parents weren't even aware of what their children were being asked. The letter sent out to parents informing them of the survey did not explain about the detailed questions on sexual history, mental health and other sensitive topics. And since, the SNP adopted an opt-out model for parents and pupils, but many children were exposed to this inappropriate questionnaire without the active consent of their parents. Cabinet Secretary, do you think it's ever okay to ask a 14-year-old questions about their sexual history without the consent of their parents?
Always through the chair, please. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I think I want to first of all recognise the strength of feeling in relation to this topic, and it is also worth recounting to Parliament that this data has been collected on one occasion only. It was collected between 2021 and 2022, and as Ms Gallagher will be well aware, only 16 local authorities that I am aware of took part in the gathering of the data. So it's important the Government reflects on that, I think, because we need to work with our local authorities in relation to how we can improve that data collection. But more broadly, she raises an issue in relation to parental consent. Now, of course, as I set out in my original answer, parental consent should have been communicated via schools, because that's how our local authorities operate in Scotland in terms of their responsibilities. That consent should have been sought. And even when parental consent was given, young people had the option to opt out, and many did, and we need to reflect that too. More broadly, she asked that question around about the holding of data, and data, of course, the Scottish Government, as I said in my original answer, is not collecting this data, and we have not collected it since June of 2022. I, as Cabinet Secretary, have also taken a decision to pause how we collect this data. I think it's important we do reflect on that. I'm sorry, I see the member doesn't have a particularly happy face right now. I thought she would have welcomed that approach from the Government, as that has been her approach throughout. Well, I can hear chuntering from a sedentary position, but I did think the member would have welcomed that approach from the Government, which shows that we are listening. More broadly, I have directly discussed these concerns with the Chief Statistician. I will be meeting with him this evening, following Parliament concluding, and I have also been reassured that he is taking appropriate steps that will reflect the strength of feeling in future discussions to collect this type of information.
Megan Gallagher.
Cabinet Secretary doesn't get it. Parents are furious about this. They're furious about the way the Scottish Government has acted in putting out
Let's hear Ms Gallagher.
About putting out the school sex survey to local government without parental consent, without parents knowing. And it has been revealed that this sensitive data, which the SNP promised would be kept confidential, is being advertised to third-party researchers. This is a blatant betrayal of trust and raises concerns about the protection of our children's privacy. So will the Cabinet Secretary please explain why this data has been shared and provide assurances that their shameful decision to do so will be reversed and never done again?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for her question. I think I recognise the member has a strength of feeling on this issue. I don't recall her asking to meet with me on it to discuss it. She also has to reflect She also needs to reflect that the data was gathered once in 2021 and 2022. It is now 2025. But if she would like to meet with me to discuss her concerns, I'm more than happy to do that. I've given her assurance today that the survey in general has been paused at my behest. I've also given her commitment. I'm engaging with the Chief Statistician on this. I hope she will recognise that I am taking direct action in relation to the concerns that she has raised today. And it is more broadly an issue that she raises in relation to data. And of course, the data was not gathered by Scottish Government. The data itself was gathered by local authorities, of which only 16 took part.
Thank you. We have several requests for supplementaries. We have an allocated time for this item, so concise questions and responses would be very helpful. And I call Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For the sake of reassurance, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm, while councils were responsible for opt-out procedures, participants in the survey are not identifiable?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for her question. I've been assured by officials that there are robust ethics and privacy controls in place to prevent any young person from being identifiable from any results of this statistical and research work. The health and wellbeing census data held by the Scottish Government is anonymised, and I have been assured that we do not have access to information that would enable the direct identification of any pupil. So the Scottish Government also ensures that any results produced from analysing this data do not enable an individual child to be identified. I hope that provides the member with the reassurance that she has sought today.
Thank you. Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer. There's great concern about this, just principally from a data point of view. And I think the assertion that individuals can't be identified is certainly disputed by those that says that there is other information in the public domain that if you match the data together, you can identify children, particularly in small schools. But can I ask the Scottish Government? The UNCRC categorically states that children have a right to have their opinions heard and taken seriously. The Information Commissioner's Office categorically states that opt-out consent is not a consent. Consent must be opt-in. The Scottish Government requested this data. The local authority then took it out and fed it into schools, where teachers then requested young people and children to complete it. There is a disparity of power between a young person in a class and their teacher if they're invited to complete something. I hear what the Cabinet Secretary, and I absolutely welcome the suspension of any further, but can she look and answer the question about how an opt-out consent was the recommended way to obtain consent for children in relation to this data collected in 21-22?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member raises an important point. He made a point in his initial question around about the views of children and young people, which I think are hugely important. And of course, the health and wellbeing census helps us to respond to those issues which children and young people are concerned about. And we know that throughout the pandemic, there were issues raised by the Children's Parliament, by the Scottish Youth Parliament, by Youth Link Scotland and by Young Scot, consistently indicating children and young people were concerned about their own health and wellbeing and those of others around them. So I think that is important. More broadly, he makes a point about opting out. As I understand it, parents were communicated with in terms of local authority responsibilities, and then, of course, if parents gave their consent, a young person could opt out. So this was not something they were forced to do, they were able to opt out. But I recognise the point. Well, I see the member is shaking his head at me. I'm more than happy to write to the member on this. He will also understand. I have paused data collection on this for reasons that have been rehearsed, I think, by Ms Gallagher today. But I'm also meeting with the Chief Statistician this evening. I'd be more than happy to write to the member on the specifics of his point with a more fulsome response.
Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, President Officer. Cabinet Secretary, the introduction to the survey that was written using wording supplied by the Scottish Government promised children and their families that their answers would not be shared out with the local authority. It is now clear that that data had been passed on to the Scottish Government, but is now being shared with them with other third-party researchers. Will the Cabinet Secretary confirm who gave the directive to pass this information on to third-party researchers, and will she meet with me and my constituent, who was on BBC Scotland last night, who has campaigned on this, so that this can be further investigated with her?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I recognise the member's interest in this topic. I know he's engaged with the government on it historically. I'm more than happy to meet with him and his constituent on this issue. I heard the reports on Reporting Scotland last night. He raised an issue in relation to data collection and instruction. I spoke to officials and I have raised this issue with them. It did not, at my understanding, come from ministers, of course. This is part of the way in which data is shared across Scottish Government, so it's not unique to this data set, and I want to give him that reassurance. But I'm more than happy to engage with the member on the issue he's raised today.